Welcome back, friends. Before we jump into this lecture, I want to let you know about a little mistake that I made, but it shouldn't really affect you, but I want to let you know anyway. When we added the Bootstrap CDN for the CSS for Bootstrap, and then we had the HTML shim respond.js, and at the bottom we added the Bootstrap.js, all from a CDN, what I realized a little later was that in order to use the Bootstrap JavaScript, it needs access to the jQuery library, which I forgot to add initially a few lectures back. So all we really need to do is add the jQuery CDN since we're just using the CDN. And I've updated the source URL to just have the 2 forward slashes rather than the HTTPS. But if you're using the code, the final course files, then that will already have been in there because I have added it in there, and that's what you would have downloaded. However, if you just copied out the code, you want to make sure to add your jQuery CDN script right here, right before the Bootstrap.js, and add it to all of your previous PHP files that you were working with that is calling the Bootstrap JavaScript. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about functions. While PHP has a massive library of built-in functions you have at your disposal, sometimes you need to be able to build your own functions for both small and very large tasks alike. So think of a custom function as a mini program that performs an action for you. So you build little chunks or little programs that you can call in order to do something. We did this earlier using our functions PHP. We played around with check for clickbait and display honest headline, and we kind of went a little bit advanced here. And in this lecture, I'm going to explain how this sort of stuff works. So let's take a look at the basic syntax of a function. Here in our functions underscore arguments.php, so I wasn't going to make a conflict with functions.php. With functions underscore arguments.php, go ahead and pull that out of your course files folder. Make sure it's all empty in the body here so you can work with me. Alternatively, you can just copy and paste from a previous lecture and so on and so forth. Make sure you're up to speed. The title in the constant here is functions and arguments. We're using it here in the title tag, and we're also using it here in a level 1 heading. Boom. PHP script right here. Let's take a look at the basic syntax of our custom function. So we got function. Use the function keyword, then the title of your custom function. My first function. There we go. To build your custom function, you need to type function, the keyword, and then the name. And keep in mind that my first function right here can be whatever words you want them to be, but as long as there's no spaces, you're good to go pretty much. Then add the opening and closing curly braces. And in between the curly braces is where you define what your function will perform. There are 2 important things to know about functions. There are functions that require arguments, and there are functions that don't require arguments. Let's start by building a custom function that does not require an argument. So I'm just going to say in this function, a, the variable, is assigned the value of 0. I'm going to create a do-while loop, a do-wop loop. It'd be so cool if it was just this do-wop. Anyway, do while. Now I'm going to say do echo a and then a non-breaking space. So do this, and then I have to increment the value of a by 1. So do this while a is less than or equal to 100. So we have a function here that has a variable of 0 and then a do while loop, which should spit out 0 to 100 with a non-breaking space after each value, so long as it is less than or equal to 100. Now, in order to use that function, you need to do what is called a function call. So typically, you'd have your functions somewhere at the top of your page, way up here, or you'd have it in a separate file like we did a while back. But right here, you can also do it as long as you call your function call later. So in order to use a function, you need to call the function using what is called a function call. Very simple. You just type out the name of the function with the parentheses and the semicolon. Now let's see what happens on our screen. So here we go. We have 0 through 100 with non-breaking spaces in between. And that looks like it worked just fine because I called the function. If I didn't call the function, then nothing would display, because there's nothing calling this function. It's just sitting there waiting for somebody to be its friend. Now, one important step in making your functions even smarter is to use what is called arguments within your function. There's a confusion around arguments versus parameters. Those words are used interchangeably a lot of the time because it's confusing. Which is what is which. Basically, we're going to talk about arguments, how to use them, and all that stuff right now. But in your parentheses in your function call is where you add your arguments. You can have one or more. You can have multiple arguments in here, separated by comma. And in your function itself, those arguments are then translated into what's called parameters. So in the function, you have parameters. So parameters go in here, and they directly correlate with the arguments you pass into the function call. So let's build another function with some arguments, and I'll show you in real time what arguments versus parameters are, whatever. Okay, so I'm going to say function, my second function. So here's our function, and in here is where I add parameters, because this is just the function. So I'm going to add a parameter. It's just going to be a variable. Typically that's the case. You just add a variable because the parameter is just waiting for an argument to be passed in. So we're just going to say the variable a. And now we're going to say in here, instead of, we'll see here we created a variable with the value of 0. In this one, we're not going to use that same thing because in our function call, we're going to pass a value in, and I'll show you now. So I'm just going to say another do while loop. I'm just going to copy this one. Do echo a non-breaking space, a plus plus, while a is less than or equal to, let's just go for 10. Okay. Now, what we need to do is call that function, and we're going to pass in an argument. So we're going to call the function my second function, and in the parentheses is where we add our argument. So instead of just putting a variable, I'm going to put an actual value here. I'm just going to say 5. So what happens now is my second function is being called with the argument 5. Function is then making a place for it, for the argument that's being passed in the parameter. And that is now going to have the value of 5. So my second function has now a value of 5 within its parentheses. So do echo a plus plus, while a is less than or equal to 10. So we should have the numbers 5 through 10. Let's see what happens. At the end here, you could see 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that worked. It might look a little confusing because we have all these other numbers here, but you can see, yes, in fact, it did work. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that is an argument, and that argument comes into the function as a parameter. Okay, so let's try an example with 2 arguments. So I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it add together. And in the parentheses is where you just add, I'm going to put 2 placeholders for parameters. So I'm going to say num1 and comma num2. So basically this function is looking for 2 arguments to be passed in. Remember, these are called parameters, but they're looking for arguments to fill in these empty spaces. You don't have to pass them in, but if the function requires these parameters, then you have to call the function with arguments. So I'm going to say new num is equal to num1 plus num2. Now in this example, we do need arguments passed into this function because it requires it in order to work. Because it's looking to do some math, num1 plus num2 is going to be stored in this new variable. And then we're going to echo those values out. Num1 plus num2 equals new num. And that's just going to give us a string of text right in there. Now we're going to call that function by saying add together. And then I'm going to pass 2 values in there, 39, 128. So these 2 values will be passed into the function right here because it's looking for 2 arguments in these parameters, and then boom, it does some math. Let's see what happens. 39 plus 128 equals 167. So there we go. That's correct. Unless PHP is bad at math, which it is never bad at math. It is always right. There we go. So those are your functions with arguments. All we did here was basically add 2 arguments in the function call, pass them into the function. You could see they correlate. We have a value, comma, value, value, comma, value. So these values are passed into these variables. Then you can use these variables within the function. They don't have to be one after another, function and then function call. You can have your function on a separate page like we did before, and then call that function later in your program, on your website, on a different page, so on and so forth. And that's how you use functions and function calls and arguments and parameters.